Hello everyone, I'm Dan the Cineman and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm going to be talking you guys through my spoiler-free and spoiler-full thoughts on Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Now, I know you'll be thinking this is a random film for me to review. You know, it came out in the 80s, it's not back in the cinemas, it's not even been recently added to anything. And I know if you watch my last video, you'll be thinking, this isn't the Wuthering Heights review that you promised us next. Unfortunately, my Wuthering Heights cinema trip fell through. I was supposed to go with my girlfriend last Tuesday, which would be the 17th of Feb, but she was not feeling great, so we had to postpone until next week. Never fear, the tickets are all booked. Tuesday, the 24th of February, we will be seeing Wuthering Heights, and I'll be dropping my review shortly after. Another one of my cinema trips that fell through, Waste Man. I'll be seeing that next week as well, so I'll also hopefully be dropping a review sometime after, probably the Wuthering Heights one. I'm not 100% yet. Maybe I'll drop two in the same week for you guys and really spoil you. But in the meantime, I wanted to talk you through my thoughts on this film that I watched for the first time earlier in the week. Full Metal Jacket is a war film, or more accurately, an anti-war film, directed by Stanley Kubrick that was released in 1987, and it stars Matthew Modine, R. Lee Ermey, Vincent D'Onofrio, Adam Baldwin, and others. The film takes place during the Vietnam War, and it follows a group of new recruits who are trained in the army and then eventually sent off to go to the front lines in Vietnam. It's been on Netflix now for a while. It's been on my watch list for a while. And yeah, I had some free time. I think it was, Tuesday just gone. Tuesday, the 17th of Feb, I managed to give it a watch, found the time. And yeah, I watched it on Netflix, really enjoyed it. And yeah, let's get into my thoughts on Stanley Kubrick's 1987 release, Full Metal Jacket. Just in case you're new here, what I do with my videos, apart from the odd exceptions, is I do a spoiler-free section and a spoiler-full section to benefit both the viewers who have seen the film and who haven't and don't want it spoiled but want general thoughts. I will mark these out using the YouTube chapter feature. If you don't want to see the spoilers, please only watch the spoiler-free section. If you have seen the film, please feel free to watch the whole way through. Just my usual quick disclaimer, throughout this video I will be using images. I try to use images that are in the public domain and so require no credit to be given. However, where this is not possible, I will give credit where credit is due in the bottom section. Okay, Full Metal Jacket. Yeah, I absolutely loved this. I have watched 3 of Stanley Kubrick's films now: Paths of Glory, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Full Metal Jacket. They've all been fantastic, and yeah, this was no different. Really, really good. Really interesting look at, the sort of horrors of war, and especially the sort of hypocrisy and irony of the US military society and culture. And here's what I said on Letterboxd. I gave it 4.5 stars, as incidentally I have done with all 3 of the Stanley Kubrick films that I've watched. And I said, second anti-war film of Kubrick's I've watched, and it's the second time I'm left questioning whether there has ever lived someone who could capture the horrors, ironies, fallacies, and dehumanization of war better than he. And then I use a quote from the film, which is, "The dead know only one thing: it is better to be alive." The film uses a two halves mechanism to really portray those horrors and that dehumanization that I mentioned in my Letterboxd review. I won't say it's a spoiler because it's included in the Letterboxd synopsis, which is what, I sort of base what I can and can't say off. And, the first half takes place in a military training camp where these new recruits are, getting drilled, they're getting hammered, everything has to be perfect. They're being made into these killing machines. And then the second half, they're, shipped off to Vietnam to fight. And in those two different environments, it shows the common denominator, which is, the toxic and the dehumanizing military culture and the impact that it has on the young men, and then the impact that their actions as a knock-on effect have on the wider world. I've seen some people say they much prefer the first half and that the second half is sort of just bashing the nail on the head that, war is horrible. I do prefer the first half. I wouldn't say I dislike the second half. I do think the first half for me is more of an interesting portrayal on those themes that I mentioned earlier, the dehumanizing effect of war and the toll that it can take on young men and young people's mental capacity. But that being said, the second half is needed to sort of show, what that impact leads these men on to do. Once they actually reach the war zone, it's the sort of chain of cruelty that we see from the very start of the boot camp to, the soldiers in the battle zone. It's that sort of continuation that's needed really to fully showcase the themes that it's going for. And I think it worked really well. I don't think the second half is weak by any means, maybe slightly weaker when compared to the first half, but yet still thought the way that worked with the two very different, halves portraying the same thing worked really well. The acting as well as the directing in this movie is top tier. You've got Matthew Modine as Joker. Now, I'd only ever seen him as Papa in Stranger Things, Dr. Brenner. So this is a bit of a surprise to see a much younger Matthew Modine playing a very different character. And yeah, he was brilliant here, present throughout the film. He played again. He sort of portrays that continuation of cruelty from the boot camp to the battle zone very well. He's a sort of personification of that. And then you've got Adam Baldwin as Animal Mother and the brilliant Vincent D'Onofrio as Pyle. Wow, his character was the highlight for me. His performance is just brilliant. I'll touch more on specifics in the spoiler full section, but yeah, he was brilliant. I would say his character and his performance was the highlight of this film. Obviously, with the subject matter of the film and the themes it was trying to get across, it really relied on, getting a good young cast of men to portray, the horrors and the fallacies, the ironies of war, especially in the US military culture, like I said before. And they definitely found that these guys, the film, relied on them, and they had a weight on their shoulders, especially in that first half. In the sort of tight knit squad aspect of the boot camp, the chemistry they had with each other was brilliant, and definitely made the movie. This film does not shy away from painting the US military in a bad light. It's not only is it about the sort of futility of war and the horror of war in general, it's also, it's not shying away from the fact that especially in this specific war, the Vietnam War, the US committed atrocities and they acted in a way that was just, went against basic human rights, the way they treated the Vietnamese people. It's all showcased in this film. And that's one of the things that I love the most about Kubrick is how brave he was. And I know that sounds like a weird adjective to use about a filmmaker, but I mean, this film came out in the 80s. The Vietnam War only ended in the decade before. It's still fresh on a lot of people's minds, and there's still a lot of people that aren't happy about the way it went down. Obviously, Stanley Kubrick included, with the US being, such a proud state, so proud of especially, their military prowess, maybe, a bit more on the right side of the political sphere. Obviously, this film would have met a lot of, backlash, but Stanley Kubrick didn't care. He wanted to get his message across, and I really admire him for that. It's not just this film as well. I mentioned previously that I've seen Paths of Glory, and that is a properly scathing portrayal of, military incompetency and the culture of wanting to win as many medals as possible, basically, from the higher ups, the officers who never really see the true battle. And that came out, I think it was mid-50s, just over a decade after World War II had ended. And war is sort of still in everyone's mind. Not that long has passed, really. Think of the generations who will have lost relatives in World War II, and now they're watching this film about the incompetency of some military generals. It's just brilliant. And yeah, it's great to watch someone get across his message, unfiltered and yeah, with full creative control. It's why I always think, directors getting final cut is just always the best way forward for the medium. And yeah, Stanley Kubrick is the prime example of that. In his Letterboxd review, my good friend Oscar quotes probably my favorite example of, the hypocrisy of the American military culture. And it's from Sergeant Hartman. It's where he says, "There is no racial bigotry here. You are all equally worthless," to the new recruits in his boot camp. He prides himself, and the US Army pride themselves on, being open and not seeing, race, religion, gender, stuff like that. But the second anyone talks about a Vietnamese person in this film, that they use racial slurs. Obviously, I'm not going to quote them, but they use various racial slurs. And it's just that hypocrisy between, priding themselves on not being racist and then using racial slurs whenever they describe the people whose country they're in. It's like I said in my Letterboxd review, I don't think there's ever existed or possibly will exist someone who just captures every horrible aspect of war that Stanley Kubrick does. Obviously I'm very thankful to the men who have given their lives so we can have freedom, but at the same time, war doesn't come without a cost, on both sides. And it does have, its horrible aspect, its dehumanization. And Stanley Kubrick is probably the best person ever to shine a light on that, and he does so brilliantly in this film. To wrap up my spoiler-free thoughts on Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, I think it's a brilliant film. It's, like I said, a brilliant look into the sort of chain of cruelty that war gives rise to. It's brilliantly acted, the direction is fantastic. It's on Netflix, and yeah, I definitely recommend giving it your time. Okay, if you're still here, you've either seen the film or you're the kind of sicko that doesn't care about spoilers before seeing a film. So let's get into my spoiler full thoughts on Full Metal Jacket. The first thing I wanted to get into was Vincent D'Onofrio's Pile, and specifically that scene where he shoots the sergeant and then shoots himself. Oh my God. It's just brilliant all round, the directing from Kubrick, the cinematography, and the acting from Vincent D'Onofrio. Wow, that look that he gives, Matthew Modine's Joker and the Sergeant. It's just pure cinema. It really is cinema. As shocking as it obviously is, you can also see how he's got to that stage, through the build up that the film shows us, and again, it's hammering home that dehumanization, that toll that the heavy preparation and the rigidness, and strictness of the boot camp has on these young men. Vincent D'Onofrio's Pile is beaten with, socks full of soap by his squad mates because they get punished every time he messes up. And it's just like a snowball from then on, and eventually his psyche breaks and, he completely breaks down and shoots his sergeant and then shoots himself. It's just brilliant. And yeah, terrifying aspect of war that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but Stanley Kubrick showcases it fantastically here through this character. Another scene involving this character that really sticks with me is one I've just alluded to. It's where the squad are first told that every time Pyle messes up, they're going to be punished. And the sergeant says it after discovering a donut in Pyle's footlocker. And he makes Pyle stand on his footlocker and eat the donut while the rest of his squad have to drop and do push-ups. It's such a great image that I don't think any other director could have, either thought of or pulled off. It really, really sticks with me. As soon as I was watching it, I thought, I'm going to remember this shot for a long time. Pyle just greedily, but also at the same time, guiltily eating this jam donut whilst he's literally standing above the rest of his squad mates, being forced to do extra exercise because of what he did. It also just makes it sort of feel inevitable that the squad are gonna, take action against him. And it's a brilliant build up to the scene where he gets beaten with the socks full of soap, because it almost shows us how the squad, got to that stage of doing something so horrible. It's because of how horrible their sergeant treats them. In terms of other scenes that stick with me, I loved the opening sequence of the new recruits getting their head shaved. It's the start of the process of getting trained up, and it just felt like such a natural point to start, but it really sort of set the scene for the film. And yeah, I loved that opening sequence. It'll definitely stay with me for a while. There was a character design decision that I loved here, and it's Joker's helmet that says "Born to Kill," and then him wearing the peace sign. When the character is asked about it, he says, he's sort of making a commentary on the duality of man. But it's also, the irony of war, and it shows the soldiers, retaining some semblance of individualism and almost revolting against, the cause. They didn't have a say in this, they're not choosing to fight these people, they're being made to do it. And yeah, this was a brilliant sort of example of that, and shows that they aren't just machines, they're not clones, they are individuals, and they're showing their personality, and this actually happened as well. There's lots of photos of soldiers who have, inscripted different things on their Zippo lighters that have been found over the years, anti-establishment messages and sort of revolution messages. And yeah, it's just brilliant to see this derived from some sort of reality as well. Just makes it hit even harder. At the same time, it doesn't, paint soldiers as these completely faultless, heroes that are being made to act against their own will. There's the scene in the helicopter where the man is on the gun, relentlessly shooting down Vietnamese citizens who look, presumably innocent. There's also the part where the Vietnamese woman is brought to the soldiers' camp, and they sort of argue about who's gonna go first when in terms of having sex with her. It shows the dark side of it as well. I have seen some people say that it's anti-soldier. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think it does a good job of painting them in both a good and bad light. In terms of both of the things I just said, it shows that they retain their individualism and they're not clones, and that they do sort of have thoughts on what they're doing, but at the same time, it does show them doing the horrible things that we know they did. This conflict obviously was quite the David v Goliath in terms of, the massively funded, massively resourceful US Army with their tanks, their guns, their helicopters versus the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong with their guerrilla warfare. And this is sort of personified really well with the sniper shootout in the second half of the film. We follow this squadron of, heavily armed men and watch them as they're picked off and nearly wiped out by a sniper. And when the squad come to capture and eventually kill the sniper, we see that it's just a young Vietnamese girl, only armed with a rifle. We see this squad of heavily armed men get decimated. I mean, I think she kills 3 or 4 of them. And yeah, it just sort of showcases the wider problem of how the US approached the Vietnamese War. They massively underestimated their enemy. And yeah, this was shown brilliantly here. To wrap up my spoiler full thoughts on Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, I think it's a brilliant watch. Like I said, there's multiple scenes that really stick out to me. They are mainly in the first half. I touched on it earlier. I do think the second half is necessary to fully punctuate the themes that Stanley Kubrick is trying to get across, but I do think the first half is probably superior. I think you'd enjoy this if you hate war. I think you'd enjoy it if you like war, to be honest. I think it's a good first Kubrick watch. I think it's a good watch if you're already familiar with his stuff. It's classic Kubrick. It's him at his brilliant, brave best. And yeah, the acting's great, specifically Vincent D'Onofrio's Pyle, I think, was definitely the standout. Really nails home. Yeah, obviously his character arc is literally the epitome of being broken down by this system, and then having a complete sort of psyche break, and then unfortunately ending his life. Tragic end, but I'm sure it happens so many times, and especially in this Vietnam War, as Kubrick is depicted here. And yeah, they were my thoughts on Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. If you've already watched this film, you know that it's available on Netflix. If you haven't already watched the film, I don't know why you're in this section of my video, but now you know the film's on Netflix and you know that you should go and watch it to see Vincent D'Onofrio's brilliant acting, Stanley Kubrick's brilliant directing and scathing commentary on, military culture. And yeah, I think it's brilliant. Thanks for listening. Really hope you enjoyed. I apologize that it's a bit of a random one. Like I said, I was supposed to have seen both Wuthering Heights and Waste Man by now, but due to unforeseen circumstances, I've seen neither. But planning on going to see Waste Man in the next week, and I've got my Wuthering Heights tickets booked, so expect a video on both of those sometime soon. I've been Dan the Cineman, and I'll see you at the movies.